In 1989, 23-year-old Adam Hecht, the son of a Hollywood film producer, mysteriously vanished from Beverly Hills. He was last seen on June 7, 1989, driving away from his home in a rented car while his own vehicle was in the repair shop. Adam Hecht grew up in a wealthy Beverly Hills family and was basically Hollywood royalty. His father, Harold Hecht, was a highly acclaimed movie producer whose filmography itself has its own Wikipedia page. Adam, then in his early 20s, was working as a tennis instructor. In early 1989, Adam befriended a homeless man known as Tony and shocked his family by inviting Tony to live in his apartment. He became disillusioned with his pampered lifestyle, and under Tony's influence, he developed an interest in meditation and mysticism. Adam often spent nights among the homeless, much to the shock of his wealthy friends and family. By June 1989, however, Adam's loved ones were growing increasingly concerned. On June 7th, he drove off in a rental car and never came back. After several days with no contact, his family reported him missing to the Beverly Hills police. When Adam's brother checked the apartment, Tony was there alone and couldn't account for Adam's whereabouts. Police questioned Tony, but he insisted he knew nothing about what happened, simply insisting that Adam was nowhere to be found. A few weeks later, Adam's rental car was found abandoned on a Beverly Hills street. It had multiple parking tickets on the windshield and the keys still in the ignition. Inside were Adam's wallet, driver's license, cash, and credit cards, but no clue to his fate. No further trace of Adam has ever been found despite extensive searches. With no evidence of a crime, police could only treat the case as a missing person matter rather than a slaying. Adam's family, however, insisted he would never leave on purpose. His brother emphasized that vanishing without a word was completely out of character for him. With no leads to follow, the case eventually went cold, although it remains open pending any new information. Two main theories have emerged about what happened to Adam Hecht. One theory is that he left voluntarily to start a new life. Disillusioned with his privileged life, Adam may have deliberately vanished to live among the homeless or to pursue a spiritual path. His keen interest in meditation and his willingness to abandon a wallet full of cash lend credence to this idea. In fact, some have suggested that leaving his keys in the ignition and his wallet full to the brim represent a conscious symbol of leaving behind his life of easy material wealth. Even police acknowledge the possibility that Adam simply decided not to return. The other theory is that Adam met with foul play. His family suspects that Tony, or someone else, may have harmed him. Tony's odd behavior and a cryptic remark he made have fueled this suspicion. About a year after the disappearance, one of Adam's family members ran into Tony and asked if he knew anything. Tony replied that if the family member, quote, stayed on the streets long enough, he would find out what happened to Adam. Some interpreted this to mean that Adam was slain by one of the homeless people he went to live amongst. Others, however, believe that this is an indication that Adam was alive and well, but living on the streets, completely rejecting his privileged upbringing. It's really hard to say what happened to Adam, but given that he never returned or contacted his family again, I have to suspect foul play as the most likely cause. That said, this is speculation on my part, since there's no hard evidence to suggest that Adam met with a grisly fate. Alternatively, though I've never seen it discussed, it's always possible that he had a mental break or dissociative fugue and simply never returned. Well, I've wanted to talk about this case forever, and I'm finally doing it, but man, this one just messes me up, and you'll see why really quickly. On February 14th, 1975, a couple driving down a rural farm road in Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana discovered the body of a young man hanging from a tree. The victim appeared to be a white male teenager around 16 to 18 years old with brown hair and eyes. At the base of the tree, investigators found a sealed glass jar containing a lengthy note addressed to Mom and Dad. In this letter, the teen expressed deep gratitude to his parents for giving him excellent advantages and privileges. However, he confessed to feeling like a false and empty vessel who never developed into a real person. He described a lifelong profound depression and a sense of detachment from life. The note even cited sociologist Emile Durkheim's writings on ending oneself, reflecting the boy's intellectual bent. In a poignant postscript, he implored authorities not to investigate his identity, stating that chasing his name would only shatter his parents' peace. To quote the teenager, "Do not deprive them of the hope that their missing son will return. Simply cremate me as John Doe." This extremely unusual request set the tone for the mystery to come. No identification was found with the body. Only a comb and a laundry marker in his clothing were recovered. Investigators in 1975 made extensive efforts to learn his name. They took the boy's fingerprints and circulated them to police nationwide, but no match turned up. The case received national media coverage, and over 300 parents of missing sons contacted the Plaquemines Parish Sheriff's Office or came to view the body. Yet after a 4-month campaign failed to identify him, the police ended up closing their file. Tragically, no official case files remain today, and the young man was ultimately interred in an unmarked grave in Gretna, Louisiana. Modern forensic efforts have been hampered by the lack of dental records or DNA. Further, because he was buried in an unmarked grave, and the case file was lost, no one is entirely certain where he was buried. That said, even if the case file hadn't been lost, it's unlikely that it would have recorded the exact location of his burial. The circumstances and the eloquent note have prompted many theories about what led this young person to take such a permanent action. Some have speculated that he might have been consumed by guilt for what he perceived as a serious wrongdoing, essentially punishing himself. Others believe he could have been struggling with his identity in an unaccepting era, contributing to his despair. Beyond motive, a major question is who this young man was. Because no local missing person matched his description, some internet sleuths have looked farther afield. One popular theory is that this John Doe might have been Bayard William Cousins, a 22-year-old from Virginia. Cousins disappeared in early February 1975 after leaving his family a note saying not to worry about him. Cousins was tall and slender with very dark brown hair and an interest in philosophy, details strikingly similar to the Plaquemines victim. However, Cousins wore glasses. None were found with the John Doe, and he was fairly substantially older than the estimated age of the John Doe. The difference between the lowest estimate for the John Doe and Cousins' actual age is 6 years, but the years between 16 and 22 are extremely significant. Further, Cousins had a very distinctive cross-shaped scar on one of his fingers, which wasn't noted by the police. Further yet, because the case file was lost, it may be the case that Cousins was already ruled out by the initial investigators. After all, they did interview approximately 300 parents, and given that Bayard went missing contemporaneously with the Doe finding, his parents may have been amongst the 300. While information obviously didn't travel to the same degree then as it does now, this story made national news. I imagine parents with a recently missing child would have been glued to the news as much as was possible in 1975, though this is admittedly speculation. Proponents of this theory suggest Bayard may have traveled over 1,000 miles to Louisiana to end himself anonymously. This lines up with the Doe's wish to spare his parents the pain of discovering his body, along with keeping their false hope of a positive resolution alive. This idea, while intriguing, remains unconfirmed, and as with investigations by internet sleuths, they work with even more incomplete data sets than the authorities do. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit that notification bell and share this video with 2 people you know. Sharing my videos with your friends and family and on your socials is the best way you can help my channel grow, and the best part is, it's entirely free. In October 1980, 47-year-old Cynthia Jabour vanished in Las Vegas. Over the ensuing years, her case was linked to several other missing persons and culminated in a landmark slaying conviction despite no body being found. Cynthia Jabour was last seen around 10:30 p.m. on October 5th, 1980, in the lobby of her boyfriend's Las Vegas condominium. She had told friends she intended to end her relationship with him that night due to his jealous and possessive behavior. When Jabour failed to return home, friends checked her apartment 2 days later and found no trace of her. No belongings were missing, and soon after, Jabour's car turned up abandoned in the parking lot of Caesars Palace Hotel. She had also left behind about $47,000 in investments that she presumably wouldn't have abandoned voluntarily. From the outset, these signs pointed to foul play rather than a voluntary disappearance. Police quickly focused on Jabour's boyfriend, Robert Weeks, as the prime suspect. When questioned, Weeks claimed she had canceled their dinner plans and he had no idea where she went. Investigators were immediately skeptical of his story. Weeks initially agreed to a lie detector test, then abruptly backed out, saying he had to leave town. Within a month of Jabour's disappearance, Weeks fled the country for Mexico and then Chile. His flight greatly heightened suspicion of his involvement. With their main suspect gone and no physical evidence, the case went cold for years, though Weeks remained the focus of investigators' suspicions. Notably, 3 years later, Weeks re-entered the States using a Libyan passport issued in the name of Robert Smith. Somehow this didn't set off any alarm bells, and he was able to resettle and resume his life in the States, living as the Libyan national Robert Smith. Somehow this may be the most absurd line I've written in the entire time I've been a YouTuber. And to give some context, I've written about the giant shrimp in the laundry room urban legend, so that's saying something. A major break came in 1986 when another woman in Weeks's life vanished in a similar manner. On April 5th, 1986, one of Weeks's girlfriends, Carol Ann Riley, disappeared in San Diego on the night she intended to break up with him. Her car was found abandoned at a hotel, mirroring Jabour's case. This prompted detectives to dig into Weeks's past, and they discovered a disturbing pattern that went beyond Cynthia Jabour. Robert's ex-wife Patricia vanished in Las Vegas in April 1968, shortly after their divorce. Her car was found abandoned, and Weeks claimed she had a nervous breakdown and fled. Unsurprisingly, she was never seen or heard from again. Weeks's business associate Jim Shaw went missing in May 1971 after a heated argument with him. Shaw's car was later found abandoned, and there were significant signs of violence. With all 4 cases spanning 18 years linked to Robert Weeks, investigators concluded they were dealing with a single perpetrator. In 1987, the investigation received nationwide exposure when the case was profiled on Unsolved Mysteries. In May 1987, a viewer tip led police to Tucson, Arizona, where Weeks was living under an alias. He was promptly arrested on an unrelated fraud charge, which allowed authorities to hold him while they built their big case. Weeks was then extradited to Nevada, and soon after he was indicted for the slaying of Cynthia Jabour and his ex-wife. He was suspected in the Riley and Shaw cases as well, though prosecutors found that there was insufficient evidence to charge him. Robert Weeks went on trial in Las Vegas in April 1988. Prosecutors argued that Weeks was a possessive, violent man who would resort to anything to prevent the women in his life from leaving. Witnesses testified about his jealousy and abusive behavior, emphasizing that neither Cynthia nor Patricia would have left their lives behind voluntarily. One of the most incriminating pieces of evidence was Weeks's personal diary. In one entry, he wrote that Cynthia had, quote, humiliated him beyond belief, and vowed to, quote, even the score. And yeah, it's always nice when the villain in the story decides to snitch on themselves, isn't it? Somewhat controversially, the evidence related to Carol Riley and Jim Shaw was also allowed to be entered into evidence, despite him not being charged in relation to those disappearances. Weeks was found guilty of first-degree slayings in both Cynthia's and Patricia's cases in April 1988. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Notably, it was the first time in Nevada history that a conviction such as this was achieved without a victim's body as evidence. Even after his conviction, Robert Weeks never revealed what became of Cynthia Jabour or the other missing individuals. None of the 4 victims' remains have ever been recovered, and investigators suspect that Weeks hid the bodies in remote desert mine shafts, which would explain the lack of physical evidence. Weeks took the secret of his victims' deaths to the grave with him, denying the families that ultimate closure they so desperately wanted. In late April 1981, a group of young men made a grim discovery along a rural road in Newton Township near Troy, Ohio. They found the body of a young woman lying in a ditch, clad in jeans, a turtleneck sweater, and a distinctive tasseled buckskin poncho. Notably, the victim was barefoot and had no identification on her, making immediate identification impossible. Police were called to the scene, and an investigation into the young woman's death began right away. An autopsy later revealed that the woman had been brutally slain. She had suffered severe blunt force trauma to her head and neck, and then was strangled, likely about 2 days before her body was found. The medical examiner also noted a laceration on her liver, consistent with a violent assault. Importantly, and surprisingly to initial investigators, there were no signs of any illicit assault on the victim. The young woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, with reddish-brown hair braided into pigtails. Further, she had very well cared for teeth, indicating that she likely had a good upbringing. These details painted a perplexing picture for investigators. The victim, clearly slain, didn't fit the profile of a transient person living on the streets, yet no one knew who she was. With no name to call her, investigators and the media gave the unidentified victim a nickname based on her clothing. The fringed suede poncho she wore led to her being dubbed the Buckskin Girl, and she became one of the most famous Jane Doe cases in the country. From the outset, Ohio authorities worked diligently to identify the victim. Because the body was found relatively soon after death, police were able to take her fingerprints and dental records for comparison. However, in 1981, there were limited computer databases, and her prints matched no criminal records, while her dental information didn't match any known missing persons reports. Investigators also released a composite sketch of the young woman's face to newspapers and TV stations in hopes that someone would recognize her. These efforts generated around 200 tips in the weeks after the slaying, but unfortunately none of them panned out. As time went on, the case grew cold, but not forgotten. The authorities preserved all the evidence from the crime scene in good condition. This included the victim's clothing and samples of her blood, with the hope that future advances might break the case. In 2001, they were able to generate a DNA profile of the victim from the preserved blood sample. In 2008, the Buckskin Girl was entered into the newly created National Missing and Unidentified Persons System database, one of the first cases to be included there. In 2016, investigators performed isotope analysis on the victim's hair and a pollen analysis on her clothing, hoping to learn where she had been before her death. These tests suggested intriguing details. Buckskin Girl had likely spent a significant amount of time in the southwestern United States shortly before she died. Conversely, pollen on her shirt and inner clothing pointed to extended time in the northeastern U.S. or Canada during the year before her death. This lined up with the theory that she was a transient or hitchhiker who traveled long distances. The victim's clean, bare feet at the crime scene also supported the idea that she hadn't walked to the dump site herself. Police believed she was slain elsewhere, perhaps indoors or in a vehicle, and her body was left beside the Ohio road not long after her death. The major breakthrough in the Buckskin Girl case finally came nearly 37 years after the act. By 2018, a new forensic method, genetic genealogy, had emerged, allowing investigators to identify victims or suspects by matching DNA to distant relatives through genealogical databases. Miami County authorities partnered with a volunteer organization, the DNA Doe Project, to apply this technique. Using the blood sample from 1981, forensic scientists obtained a high-quality DNA profile of the victim and uploaded it to a public genealogy database. In March 2018, within only a few hours of analysis, genealogists found a potential family connection. In early April 2018, the Miami Valley Regional Crime Laboratory confirmed the identification by obtaining DNA from a relative of the missing woman and comparing it to the victim. In a press conference on April 11, 2018, authorities announced that the Buckskin Girl had been identified as Marcia King, a 21-year-old woman from Arkansas. Marcia King had last been seen by her family in 1980, when she left home in Little Rock and traveled out of state. Because she was an adult and no one suspected she was in danger, her family never filed an official missing persons report. Marcia King's identification was groundbreaking for law enforcement. She was one of the first unidentified victims to be identified through forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that would soon become famous for helping solve other cold cases. Marcia's family, who had quietly hoped for her return for years, now had closure about her fate, though it was a sad confirmation of her death. In Ohio, the Jane Doe headstone at her grave was replaced with a new marker bearing Marcia's name, and a memorial service was held where local residents and officers paid their respects. The identification also renewed energy in the investigation, since knowing Marcia's identity gave detectives new leads about where she had been and who she associated with. Even with Marcia King's identity known, the question of who ended her remains unanswered. Before she was identified, investigators considered that she might have been a teenage runaway or a hitchhiker traveling across states. Indeed, after her identification, it became clear Marcia often hitchhiked and had ties to multiple cities like Pittsburgh and Louisville during her travels. Her well-kept appearance, however, indicated she wasn't living homeless, and that she likely had places to stay or people helping her along the way. It's been speculated that she may have been living out of a vehicle, such as a van, when she met her untimely end. Investigators and internet sleuths have speculated that she may have been slain by an as-yet unknown boyfriend or male traveling partner. Others speculate that she may have been in a traveling cult, a theory which has some evidence for it, and which I'll come back to shortly. Given the era and Marcia's red hair, detectives examined possible links to known serial perpetrators. In 1985, her case was briefly considered as possibly related to the so-called redhead slayings, a series of violent acts against red-haired young women across the United States. However, this connection was eventually ruled out as evidence recovered from the scenes of those crimes and other case specifics didn't match. Others wondered if Marcia might have been an early victim of an unidentified serial wrongdoer, nicknamed Dr. No, who was known for targeting women along Ohio highways in the 1980s. Despite these theories, no known suspect has ever been arrested or charged in Marcia King's slaying. However, there have been positive movements in the investigation, and since her identification, investigators have pieced together some of her final movements. Marcia was reportedly seen in early April 1981 in Louisville, Kentucky, and possibly was involved with a traveling religious group or cult around the time of her death. At present, the authorities still believe that the most likely person responsible for Marcia King's slaying is an as yet identified boyfriend.